The Vanishing Heir, a Hercule Poirot Mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. Tonight, we travel south, far south, to where the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast plunge into a sea so blue it seems almost invented, to a villa of pale stone and bougainvillea, of crystal glasses and jasmine on the evening air, where beauty is not merely decoration, but weaponry, where a chair sits empty at the dinner table, where a gold chain around a beautiful woman's throat is heavier than it ought to be, and where, beneath the glittering surface of extraordinary wealth and impeccable manners, something moves in the deep water. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. The game, as my old friend would say, is very much afoot. Chapter 1. The Beautiful Surface. It was, Hercule Poirot reflected, precisely the sort of beauty that demanded to be mistrusted. The Villa Serena clung to the cliffside above Positano with a conviction that seemed to border on the miraculous. Its terraces descended in pale cascades of stone, fragrant with lemon blossom and trailing bougainvillea, of a purple so extravagant it appeared almost theatrical. Below, the Tyrrhenian Sea glittered with the blind, brilliant certainty of hammered enamel. Above, the afternoon sky was the blue of a postcard, generous, uncomplicated, and entirely without shadow. Poirot sat on the upper terrace in a chair of exceptional comfort and surveyed all of it with the mild, attentive expression of a man who has been presented with a problem he has not yet been asked to solve. He was wearing white linen, pressed to a severity that would have shamed lesser garments. His shoes of a cream-coloured calfskin procured from a particular establishment in the Rue Saint-Honoré gleamed with quiet authority. His moustaches, those magnificent, those irreproachable moustaches, had been attended to that very morning with a devotion bordering on the liturgical. He looked, as he was entirely aware, quite splendid. A young man in a white jacket appeared silently at his elbow and replenished his Franciacorta with the deference appropriate to an object of genuine value. Poirot accepted this with a small inclination of his egg-shaped head. He sipped. He approved. The wine was excellent. He had been invited to the Villa Serena by Signor Lorenzo Valenti, financier, collector, and host of legendary discrimination. For what that gentleman had termed in his brief and elegant telegram, "A little peace, my dear Poirot, and the finest air on the Amalfi Coast." Poirot had accepted with pleasure. He was not, despite certain popular misconceptions, a man who was indifferent to pleasure. He was simply a man who could not permit himself to be deceived by it. And here, he thought, there was much that was designed to deceive. He watched the other guests arrange themselves across the terrace with the unconscious choreography of people accustomed to being observed. There was Adriana Valenti, the host's daughter, and seated at the far end in a drift of ivory silk that had cost, Poirot estimated, what an honest man might earn in several months. She was 26 and possessed of a beauty so fluent and so perfectly deployed that it required considerable effort to look past it. Several of the gentlemen present were failing in this effort quite visibly. Adriana spoke in 3 languages with equal charm, and moved with the languid precision of someone who has never been required to hurry. The terrace, Poirot noted, arranged itself around her as iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. The phenomenon was neither accidental nor entirely innocent. She wore very little jewellery. A simple gold chain at her throat, slender as a whisper. It was, in its studied modesty among her other adornments, conspicuous. Poirot's gaze lingered on it for a moment longer than was perhaps apparent. Lorenzo Valenti himself stood near the balustrade, a glass in one hand, and the particular stillness of a man who is accustomed to rooms falling quiet when he enters them. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair worn close, and eyes of a grey so pale they suggested not coldness exactly, but a fundamental remove from ordinary human temperature. He had built, or rather, had refined and consolidated, a fortune of considerable antiquity into something considerably larger. The villa, the wine, the guest list, all of it bore the hallmark of his taste, which was genuine, and his ruthlessness, which was equally so. He smiled when their eyes met across the terrace, and came towards Poirot with the easy authority of a man entirely at home in his own creation. "I am Monsieur Poirot." He settled into the neighbouring chair with the ease of long familiarity. "You find everything to your satisfaction, I hope." "Eminently so, Signor Valenti. The wine is beyond reproach. The view," Poirot glanced at the sea, "is all that nature can do when it is at its most ambitious, and the company, no doubt, will prove equally diverting." Valenti smiled. It was an expression that reached his eyes on a slight delay, as though routed through some internal approval process. "I have gathered some interesting people. I find that interesting people make for a more stimulating holiday." "Indeed." Poirot allowed his gaze to travel thoughtfully across the terrace. "And your son, Signor Valenti. I had hoped to make the acquaintance of Matteo. I have heard of him, of course. Quite the most talked-of young man in Rome, they tell me." Something passed across Valenti's face. A flicker of something that was not quite pain and not quite anger, but partook of both. It was gone so quickly that a less attentive observer would have missed it entirely. "Matteo is travelling," Valenti said. His tone was pleasant, his smile intact. "Young men must have their adventures, n'est-ce pas? He will join us when his schedule permits." "But of course," said Poirot pleasantly, and said no more. He had already noted at the far end of the terrace an American of large physical presence and larger confidence, whose cufflinks caught the afternoon sun with a flash that was a fraction too insistent. This would be Daniel Reed, of whom Poirot had formed certain preliminary impressions from Valenti's letter. A self-made man, a technology magnate, a person of considerable energy and perhaps rather less settled identity. Reed was studying the terrace with the focused attention of a man appraising an auction room before the sale. He studied Adriana. He studied the view. He studied, with the greatest interest of all, Lorenzo Valenti himself. He wants something, Poirot thought. They always want something. The fourth notable presence on the terrace was a woman who had positioned herself, or who had been positioned, at a distance from the host that was fractionally but distinctly too great for an intimate acquaintance. The Countess Sophia Markovitch was handsome in the manner of a portrait from another century. High cheekbones, deep-set dark eyes, a carriage of such elaborate dignity that it constituted in itself a kind of performance. She had been, Poirot understood, Lorenzo Valenti's closest companion some years ago. She was so no longer, and she was aware of this fact with every nerve in her body. Her gown was exquisite. Her jewelry was substantial. Her eyes, when they rested on their host, contained an emotion she had insufficient art to entirely conceal. She was watching, Poirot noted. They were all watching, after their fashions. There remained a small, discreet Frenchwoman of perhaps 35, who moved among the guests with the quiet efficiency of someone whose primary function is the management of other people's difficulties. Juliette Arnaud, Valenti's personal assistant. She replenished glasses that were not yet empty, murmured into the host's ear at intervals, and kept the whole magnificent machinery of the villa running with a smoothness that was its own sort of artistry. Poirot had encountered her type before, the indispensable one, the keeper of appointments and passwords, and perhaps of rather more besides. And there was Dr. Kenji Takahashi, a Japanese art investor of considerable reputation, who sat somewhat apart from the group with the serene detachment of a man whose interests are internal and who finds external spectacle mildly taxing. He had nodded to Poirot with great courtesy upon his arrival, and had since devoted himself principally to the contemplation of the sea. Dinner was served as the sun performed its nightly extravagance over the water, gold dissolving into amber, amber into rose, the whole theatre of it reflected in the crystal glasses and the pale stone of the terrace. They sat, 7 of them, around a table that a considerable staff had arranged with flawless attention to detail. Then an 8th chair remained, set with silver and flowers, conspicuously unoccupied. It was Adriana who noticed that Poirot had noticed it. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and something that was not quite an appeal moved across her face. Lorenzo Valenti rose at the head of the table and lifted his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, welcome to Villa Serena. I propose a toast." He paused. When he smiled, it was the smile of a man who has rehearsed magnanimity until it fits like a second skin. "To family," he said, "to what remains of it." Adriana's hand, Poirot observed, trembled very slightly against the stem of her glass. It was the smallest of movements. One had to be looking. Daniel Reed raised his glass with enthusiasm and drank. The Countess lifted hers and did not drink. Juliette Arnaud, moving quietly at the edge of the candlelight, reached across to remove the unused setting from the empty chair. And as she lifted the napkin, something small and metallic caught the light for an instant before disappearing into the pocket of her jacket. Poirot said nothing. He smiled. He ate his soup, which was very good indeed. But the grey cells, those little grey cells, they were, he reflected, already entirely awake. Below the terrace, the sea gleamed in the last of the light. It was very beautiful, and very still, and concealed, as beautiful things so often do, a great deal that was neither. Chapter 2. The Amalfi Illusion. The morning arrived at the Villa Serena with the same serene impertinence as its predecessor. All gold light and jasmine and the distant, patient breathing of the sea. Poirot, who had slept with the methodical thoroughness he applied to all necessary activities, was already dressed and seated on the lower terrace with his breakfast when the first of the other guests made their appearance. He was, as was his habit, early. The advantage of this was considerable. The terrace at this hour belonged to a different order of truth. Without the flattery of candlelight and fine wine and the collective performance of dinner, it revealed itself as what it was: stone and iron and carefully tended greenery, very beautiful and entirely indifferent to the people it housed. A gardener moved with quiet industry among the lemon trees. A gull described a slow arc above the cliff's edge and disappeared. Somewhere below, the sea went about its ancient business without reference to any of them. Poirot buttered a small triangle of toast with precise attention and considered what he had observed the previous evening. Several things had arranged themselves in his mind with the satisfying clarity of objects properly ordered. Juliette Arnaud and the metallic thing she had removed from the table setting. That required explanation. The toast, he bit into it. The empty chair with its silver and flowers, set as though Matteo Valenti's absence were a matter of hours rather than months. That was deliberate. Everything at this villa was deliberate. The question, as always, was whose deliberation one was examining. He heard her before he saw her. Adriana Valenti moved with characteristic grace, but this morning, at a pace that suggested purpose rather than performance, and she stopped very slightly when she found Poirot already in residence. Monsieur Poirot. She recovered herself in an instant as one who had been recovering herself in instants for a considerable number of years. You are an early riser. One of my few virtues, said Poirot, and gestured with great courtesy towards the neighbouring chair. The coffee is excellent. You will join me, mademoiselle. She sat, which was interesting in itself. Poirot had observed that when people avoid being alone with him, they generally have reason. Adriana, it seemed, had decided on a different strategy. The gold chain was at her throat again. In the morning light, without diamonds and silk competing for attention, Poirot could examine it more carefully. It was elegant, yes. Simple, yes. But there was a faint thickening at the base of the pendant. Barely perceptible, a slight heaviness that did not correspond to the slenderness of the chain above it. He noted this and said nothing whatsoever about it. You slept well? He asked instead. Tolerably. She poured her coffee with steady hands. Steadier, he observed, than they had been the previous evening. And you found the villa comfortable? Papa is very particular about his guests' comfort. Your father is particular about a great many things, Poirot agreed pleasantly. He is a man of considerable precision. One sees it everywhere, in the wine, the arrangement of the rooms, the guest list itself. Everything selected, everything intentional. Adriana regarded him with eyes that were intelligent beneath their social gloss. You make it sound rather calculating. Not at all. I make it sound like connoisseurship. The two are not always the same, though they are sometimes difficult to distinguish. He tilted his head slightly. Your brother, Mademoiselle, Matteo. When did you last speak with him? The pause was very brief. Some weeks ago. As Papa said, he is travelling. Travelling, Poirot repeated, as though the word were a small and curious object he was turning over in his hands. And does Matteo generally travel without informing his family of his whereabouts? Forgive me. I ask only because that empty chair last evening suggested a certain expectation. One sets a place for a guest one expects to arrive, not for one who is contentedly abroad and not expected. Adriana looked at him for a moment in silence. It was, he thought, the look of a person calculating not whether to trust, but how much trust the situation required. Matteo, she said at last, has always done things in his own way and in his own time. She set down her cup. It is one of the things about him that Papa finds most admirable and most infuriating in approximately equal measure. A young man of independent character, Poirot said. How refreshing! And yet Here I am, the famous detective, invited for a little piece. One wonders, does one not, whether the piece in question is geographical or of some other variety entirely? She met his eyes. You should ask Papa that. I intend to, said Poirot serenely, among other things. She left him shortly afterwards, moving back through the villa's interior with that quality of controlled fluency that he was coming to recognize as her primary mode of concealment. What she felt, he suspected, was a great deal. What she showed was a performance of such accomplishment it had probably deceived most people for most of her life. Not, however, all people. And not, perhaps, for very much longer. Daniel Reed arrived on the terrace at 8:30, with the vigorous appetite of a man who has slept without the inconvenience of a guilty conscience, or who is accustomed to suppressing it. He was large, fair, and gave off the particular energy of someone who experiences stillness as a personal affront. He poured himself coffee, took 3 appreciative gulps, and turned to regard Poirot with an expression of frank appraisal. "You're the detective fellow," he said. It was not a question. "I am Hercule Poirot," Poirot agreed with a courtesy so precise it contained for the observant a faint irony. Reed sat down without invitation, which told Poirot something. "I've heard of you. You're good, they say." "They are not mistaken." Reed laughed, a large sound, entirely genuine, with a fraction too much duration. "I like that. No false modesty." He refilled his cup. "Lorenzo mentioned you'd be here. He's a great admirer, apparently." "Signor Valenti is too kind." "He's not, actually." Reed said it without heat, almost with admiration. "That's one of the things I respect about him. He doesn't waste kindness. When he says he admires something, it's because he's calculated its value." He looked out at the sea. "I'm working on a significant investment arrangement with Lorenzo. Art-backed assets. Very sophisticated structure. Takahashi's involved on the acquisition side." He said this as a man says things he wishes on record. A legitimate enterprise, top to bottom. "But, naturally," said Poirot. Something flickered in Reed's expression. A momentary recalibration, as though he had heard a tone he had not anticipated. "Naturally," he agreed after the smallest pause. "And Matteo," Poirot said with the air of a man making entirely idle conversation. "He is involved in his father's business interests." "Matteo." Reed's voice acquired a careful neutrality. "Matteo has his own outlook. Let's leave it at that." He departed soon after with the air of a man who has accomplished something, although Poirot was not entirely certain Reed himself could have specified what. The Countess Markovitch came last, descending to the terrace at a civilized hour in a morning ensemble that was faultless, and, in its faultlessness, slightly heartbreaking. The effort of someone who cannot afford to appear anything less than immaculate. She nodded to Poirot with the measured warmth of one aristocrat acknowledging another, which was, he felt, both the greatest compliment she could offer and a slight misapprehension of his origins. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, which the Countess then broke with unexpected directness. "You are here about Matteo," she said. It was not the tentative venture of a question, but the flat assertion of a conclusion reached privately some time ago. Poirot looked at her with genuine interest. "What makes you say so?" "Because Lorenzo Valenti does not invite people for their charm," she said. "He invites them for their utility. I know this better than most." The last sentence was spoken without self-pity, which made it considerably more effective than self-pity would have been. He invited you because he needs you, and the only thing Lorenzo needs that money has not yet provided. She stopped. Is his son, said Poirot quietly. The Countess looked at the sea. Find the boy, Monsieur Poirot, she said. Whatever else is happening here, and I assure you a great deal is happening, find the boy first. It was, Poirot reflected as he made his way inside, the most honest thing anyone had said to him since his arrival. He paused in the cool interior of the villa's entrance hall, where an enormous arrangement of white lilies stood in a stone urn, their scent almost oppressively pure, and allowed himself one moment of perfect stillness. Matteo Valenti was not travelling. Of that, Hercule Poirot was now entirely certain. The question that remained, the question that the little grey cells were already arranging themselves to answer, was rather more serious. He straightened his tie, which did not require straightening, and went to find Lorenzo Valenti. Chapter 3. The Price of Everything. Lorenzo Valenti received him in his study, which was the kind of room that told you everything about a man if you knew how to read rooms, and Poirot had always found them among the most instructive of texts. It faced the sea, naturally. The desk was vast, antique, and entirely uncluttered. The desk of a man who has other people to manage the clutter on his behalf. The art on the walls had been chosen with the unerring eye of someone who understands that beauty, correctly displayed, is a form of authority. A small Morandi on the near wall, a Fontana on the far one. Between them, occupying the place of greatest prominence, a family portrait, Lorenzo, younger and already formidable, with his arm around a boy of perhaps 12, whose smile was the most unguarded thing in the entire villa. Matteo. Even in paint, he was unmistakably himself. Valenti was standing at the window when Poirot entered. He turned with the measured ease of a man who does not permit himself to be caught unprepared, and gestured towards a pair of chairs arranged before an unlit fireplace. The gesture was gracious. The eyes, above it, were not. Monsieur Poirot, I had wondered when you would come to see me privately. Did you doubt that I would? No. Valenti sat, crossed one leg over the other with perfect composure, and regarded Poirot with the frank assessment of a man long accustomed to evaluating assets. I invited you here because I require your particular capabilities. I had intended to raise the matter this evening at a moment of my choosing. You have, I see, other ideas about the moment. I find, said Poirot gently, that moments chosen by the person with something to conceal are rarely the most productive. Now then, Signor Valenti, your son. The composure held, but at a cost that Poirot could measure now with some precision. Matteo has been missing for 3 months, Valenti said. I have engaged private investigators, discreet ones. I have made inquiries through channels which I will not specify, and which you need not ask me to. I have heard nothing. You did not go to the police? No. Because, Poirot said with the careful neutrality of a man placing a delicate object on a surface, the inquiries through unspecified channels would not survive police scrutiny. A pause of considerable weight settled between them. Valenti's eyes did not waver. My business interests are complex, Monsieur Poirot, as are those of many men in my position. I did not build what I have built by welcoming official examinations of my affairs at inconvenient moments. And Matteo, Poirot pressed, very quietly, What did Matteo know of these complex interests? He was my son, Valenti said. He knew what sons know. It was not an answer, and they both recognized it as such. Poirot allowed it to stand without challenge, which was occasionally more useful than argument. "Tell me about him," he said instead. "Not the official version. I have formed impressions of that already. Tell me about the young man himself." For the first time, something shifted in Valenti's face that was neither calculation nor performance. It was the expression of a man looking at something he cannot manage, which was, Poirot suspected, the most unfamiliar sensation of Lorenzo Valenti's adult life. "He was warm," Valenti said after a moment. "Genuinely warm, which is rarer than people suppose. He had no talent for cruelty and no interest in cultivating one. He was, in many ways, entirely unsuited to the world he was born into." A pause. "I loved him for it, in spite of everything." "In spite of his unsuitability for your world," Poirot said, "or in spite of something more specific?" Valenti's jaw tightened fractionally. He had formed views about certain aspects of the family's financial structure. He felt they were indefensible. He said so to me on more than one occasion. And the last occasion? 3 months and 4 days ago. The precision of this, unstudied, immediate, told Poirot rather more than Valenti had intended to reveal. He told me he intended to act on his convictions. I told him he did not understand the full picture. He said... Valenti stopped. When he resumed, his voice was a degree quieter. He said that he understood it perfectly, which was precisely why he could not remain silent. Poirot was still for a moment, looking not at Valenti but at the portrait on the wall. The boy with the unguarded smile. "I should like," he said, "to see Matteo's rooms." He was escorted there by Juliette Arnaud, who materialized in the corridor outside Valenti's study, with the timing of someone who had been awaiting the conclusion of a meeting rather than merely passing by. She was brisk, correct, and so carefully composed that her composure was itself the most interesting thing about her. Matteo's rooms were on the villa's upper floor, facing not the sea but the mountain, which told you something about Matteo Valenti, Poirot thought, even before he crossed the threshold. The young man had chosen to look at the land rather than the view his father's money had purchased. There was either great stubbornness or great principle in that, and possibly both. The rooms had been preserved with a neatness that suggested they had been gone through carefully and then restored to apparent order. Poirot noted this without remarking upon it. He moved through them methodically, touching very little, observing a great deal. Books, in Italian, English, French, with the broken spines of genuine readers. A guitar in the corner, not decorative. Photographs pinned without frames to the plaster above the desk. Friends at a Roman trattoria. A protest march with handmade signs. A holiday somewhere coastal and inexpensive. Not the Amalfi Coast. Somewhere that had not been curated for a guest list. Then, in the wardrobe, behind a row of excellent suits that had belonged to a man who wore them reluctantly, Poirot found the childhood room. Not a room, a shelf, a single shelf, low down, on which were arranged a set of objects with the careful intentionality of small devotions. A football program from 1987, a chipped ceramic dog of considerable ugliness, a child's drawing much folded and refolded, and inside a velvet watchbox of evident quality, its satin interior rather too large for its current contents, a cheap, faded photograph. Poirot lifted it with two careful fingers. Lorenzo Valenti and a boy of perhaps 9 or 10 on a beach. Public beach from the look of it. Striped municipal umbrellas, crowded sand, the democratic chaos of ordinary Italian summer. No guards, no yachts, no curation whatsoever. Lorenzo was laughing, actually laughing with the unself-conscious abandon of a man not yet entirely formed into what he would become. Yet the boy leaned against him with the complete trust of someone who has not yet discovered that trust requires consideration. Poirot turned the photograph over. On the back, in ink that was recent, not faded with the photograph, but sharp and dark against the paper, someone had written, "When you loved me for being yours." He stood with it for a long moment in the quiet room. Then he replaced it precisely as he had found it, closed the watchbox, and looked again at the shelf. There was a gap in the satin interior of the box, he now saw. A slight depression, slightly too wide for the photograph alone. Something else had rested there and been removed. Something of roughly similar dimensions but greater weight. He descended to the lower floor with the unhurried air of a man with no particular destination in mind. In the corridor, he encountered Juliette Arnaud returning from some errand, and they stopped simultaneously in the narrow space between a console table and the wall. "Mademoiselle Arnaud," said Poirot pleasantly, "I wonder, the item you removed from Matteo's place setting at dinner last evening. May I ask what it was?" Her face did not change precisely, but some quality within it altered, as a sky alters before weather, without any individual cloud announcing itself. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot." "I think you do," he said with great kindness. "And I think, moreover, that you are a woman of rather more conscience than your current situation has permitted you to exercise. When you are ready to speak, and I suggest that the moment approaches rather more quickly than is comfortable, you will find me a most attentive listener." He continued along the corridor to the terrace. Behind him, a long silence. Then, from the private beach below the villa, a shout, urgent, male, stripped of all social ornament, rose above the sound of the sea. And Hercule Poirot moved, for once in his careful life, with genuine haste. Chapter 4. The Beautiful Liars. The beach, reached by a switchback of stone steps cut directly into the cliff face, was a narrow crescent of pale sand entirely enclosed by rock. It belonged, like everything else within a considerable radius, to Lorenzo Valenti. This morning it contained rather more than its owner had bargained for. Matteo Valenti lay on a striped towel with the terrible stillness of someone from whom all future movement has been permanently removed. He was handsome. One could see that immediately, and it struck one immediately as irrelevant in the way that such things become irrelevant very quickly in the presence of death. He was, or had been, perhaps 30. He wore linen trousers and a pale shirt, open at the collar, and his expression was one of such perfect repose that a person of less experience than Poirot might have entertained for half a second the idea that he was simply sleeping. Beside him, a silver champagne bucket rested in the sand, still cool to the touch, when Poirot bent carefully to examine it. 2 crystal flutes stood nearby, one empty and perfectly dry, one containing perhaps a finger's breadth of liquid, and the bubbles long since departed. The young man from the kitchen staff who had raised the alarm stood at a distance with the grey, fixed expression of someone whose mourning had comprehensively exceeded its brief. He had come down, he said, to set up for the family's morning swim. He had touched nothing, Poirot believed him. The others arrived in stages. First Adriana, who came down the steps at speed and stopped at the base of them as though she had walked into glass. Then Valenti himself, who crossed the sand in 4 deliberate strides and stood looking down at his son with a stillness so absolute it seemed to require immense structural effort to maintain. Then Reed and the Countess, and finally Juliette Arnaud, who stopped several feet from the body and pressed one hand briefly to her mouth before lowering it with visible resolution. Dr. Takahashi, who had medical training of a general rather than forensic variety, confirmed what they all already knew and pronounced that the young man had been dead for some hours. The Italian police, summoned by telephone from the villa, would take the better part of an hour to arrive by boat. In the meantime, Poirot had requested, with the pleasant authority of a man accustomed to having such requests granted, that everyone remain on the beach. He moved around the scene with his hands clasped behind his back, touching nothing, disturbing nothing, examining everything. The towel had been placed with deliberate neatness, its edges aligned, its surface smoothed. The champagne bucket stood at precisely the angle of someone who had put it down with care rather than set it casually. And even the arrangement of the crystal flutes suggested intention, parallel, equidistant, as though set by a hand that wished the composition to read correctly from a certain angle. Death had been styled. The thought settled in Poirot's mind with a cold and particular weight. He examined the area around the body without approaching the body itself. The sand near the towel had been smoothed in a rough semicircle. Not perfectly, but enough. Footprints where they remained were confused and overlapping. Deliberate confusion, he thought, rather than accidental. Someone had taken moderate care without taking exceptional care, which was itself informative. Exceptional care suggests foreknowledge. Moderate care suggests improvisation upon a prepared plan. He straightened and looked at the assembled faces. Grief, where it was present, I wore different costumes. Adriana had not cried. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, and her face directed at the water, and the quality of her silence was the quality of a person engaged in the enormous private labour of containing something that wishes very much to escape. Valenti had not moved from where he stood. His face, Poirot noted, had undergone a strange simplification. The architecture of social control stripped away to reveal something older and rawer beneath it. The face of a man who has received news he simultaneously did not expect and always feared. The Countess was weeping. She wept beautifully, with the practiced grace of someone for whom tears have long been a social instrument. Yet for all that, Poirot was not entirely certain the grief was counterfeit. People, he had found, you rarely felt only one thing at a time, even when performing the simplest of emotions. Reed stood with his arms folded and said nothing, which was, from a man who generally treated silence as a vacuum requiring urgent filling, itself a statement. Juliette Arnaud had not looked at the body since her first moment on the beach. She looked at Lorenzo Valenti instead, with a steady and complex attention that Poirot filed carefully away. The police arrived with the reasonable efficiency of men accustomed to complicated situations in complicated jurisdictions, and Poirot spent some time in quiet and productive conversation with the inspector in charge, a compact, intelligent Neapolitan named Ferrara, who recognized Poirot's name with gratifying promptness and was accordingly disposed to share rather more than protocol strictly encouraged. At the preliminary assessment, Ferrara confided, suggested poisoning. There were the characteristic signs. A toxicological analysis would confirm it, but the inspector had seen enough to form his own view, and his view was that the young man had been given something in what he had eaten or drunk, and that whatever it was had been both effective and, in the inspector's word, specialized. Not a common poison, Ferrara said. Not something purchased at a pharmacy, something that requires knowledge, or very particular connections. Poirot thanked him with great warmth and returned his attention to the living. That afternoon, while the villa absorbed the shock of official presence in the way that villas of a certain class absorb such things, with subdued staff, closed doors, and a notable increase in the consumption of Valenti's better wines, Poirot was permitted access to Juliette Arnaud's small, immaculate office on the ground floor. He had requested this access of Inspector Ferrara, who had granted it with the understanding that any discoveries of interest would be promptly communicated. The office was as organized as its occupant, everything in its place, everything labeled, the kind of order that speaks not of a naturally tidy mind, but of a mind that has trained itself to tidiness as a discipline, because tidiness makes secrets easier to keep. He found it in the second drawer of the filing cabinet, in a folder labelled with a reference number that meant nothing to a casual observer, and a great deal, Poirot suspected, to whoever had created the filing system. A bank transfer confirmation. 5 million euros moved from Matteo Valenti's personal trust account to a numbered offshore account in the Cayman Islands, the beneficial ownership of which was registered, not hidden precisely, but requiring several steps to confirm, to a holding company whose sole director was listed as Daniel Reed. Poirot read it twice. Then he examined the timestamp at the top of the document with close and sustained attention. The transfer had been completed at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning. Matteo Valenti, according to Dr. Takahashi's preliminary assessment and Inspector Ferrara's concurrence, had in all probability been dead before midnight. A dead man, it appeared, had moved 5 million euros in the small hours of the morning. Poirot replaced the document with care, closed the drawer, and sat for a moment in Juliette Arnaud's tidy chair in Juliette Arnaud's tidy office, his fingertips pressed lightly together and his egg-shaped head tilted at the particular angle it assumed when a problem had just become, simultaneously, simpler and considerably more interesting. The champagne flutes on the beach. 2 of them. One empty. One barely touched. Someone had sat with Matteo Valenti while he died. Someone who had then walked away up those cliff-cut steps in the dark and taken considerable pains over the arrangement of a scene designed to suggest, to the eye of the casual or even the moderately attentive observer, that nothing here required explanation. The alibi, when they were eventually offered, were, as he had by now come to expect from this particular gathering, exquisite. Adriana had spent the previous evening live-streaming a charity rehearsal from her suite, her face bright and animated on screen until well past midnight. Her phone records would confirm it. Her followers, 40,000 of them, had watched in real time. Poirot made a mental note to look very carefully at the gold chain in that footage. Daniel Reed had retired early with a migraine, attested by 2 members of staff who had brought him ice and aspirin at separate intervals. The Countess had been seen in the upper salon until 11, reading. Juliette Arnaud had been working in her office, this very office, until at least 1 in the morning, confirmed by telephone records showing a call placed to Geneva. Each account was clean, specific, and supported by at least one corroborating detail. They lied, Poirot thought, the way they did everything in this villa, with style, with preparation, and with the serene assumption that beauty of execution was indistinguishable from truth. He was rather looking forward to demonstrating otherwise. Chapter 5. What Money Cannot Buy. He began with Adriana, not because she was the most obvious subject, she was not, but because she was the one most likely to tell him something true without intending to. And Poirot had always found that unintentional truth, properly harvested, was considerably more nourishing than the deliberate variety. She received him in the salon on the villa's middle floor, a room of pale walls and good light that managed, despite its beauty, to feel rather cold. She was sitting when he arrived, and she did not rise, which told him that the social machinery had been partly disengaged. She was too tired, or too frightened, or too close to something genuine to operate it at full capacity. She wore black, simply cut. The gold chain was at her throat. Poirot sat across from her and spent a brief moment doing nothing in particular, a technique he had always found remarkably productive. "You will want to ask me things," Adriana said at last. Her English was perfect, lightly accented, and today carried none of its habitual performance. "Everyone wants to ask me things. The inspector has already asked me a great many." "Inspector Ferrara is a thorough man," Poirot agreed. "I, however, am interested in somewhat different things than Inspector Ferrara." He paused. "When did you last speak to your brother without an audience?" Mademoiselle." The question arrived quietly, without preamble, and she received it in the manner of someone who had not been expecting precisely that angle of approach. Her hands resting in her lap became very still. "I don't understand what you mean." "I think you do. You are a young woman who is very rarely without an audience. Your brother, from what I understand, was much the same, though the audiences were of a rather different kind. I am asking when the two of you last spoke as yourselves, without the performance that your respective positions require." The silence ran on for longer than comfortable. Outside, a boat crossed the bay at leisurely speed, and the sound of its motor came faint and remote through the shuttered windows. "4 months ago," she said, "in Rome. We met at a friend's apartment, no one from Papa's world. We talked for a very long time." She looked at a point somewhere to Poirot's left. "He told me what he intended to do, about the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, Papa's network. Matteo had been documenting it for over a year. He had names, transactions, correspondences. He intended to pass it to a journalist he trusted." She stopped. "I told him it was dangerous. He said that the alternative was more dangerous, in a different way. A danger to the soul, he said. He was like that." "And you?" Poirot asked. "Were you of the same mind?" Her jaw tightened. "I am my father's daughter, Monsieur Poirot, in ways that Matteo never was and never wanted to be. But I am also—" She paused, searching for the word with an honesty that surprised him. "I am also someone who has been performing a version of herself for so long that she is not entirely certain where the performance ends." She looked directly at him then for the first time. "I gave him money, from my own accounts, not Papa's. Enough to disappear if he chose to, enough to start elsewhere." "The escape fund," Poirot said softly. She blinked. "He told you?" "He told no one. But money that moves in secret and with urgency generally has one of two destinations: flight or extortion. Your brother, I think, was not a man who dealt in extortion. He studied her. The chain, mademoiselle. It was his, was it not? He asked you to wear it. Her hand went to it involuntarily, the gesture of someone touching a thing they have touched 100 times in private anguish. He gave it to me 3 months ago, just before he disappeared. He said if anything happened, I should keep it safe, that it was important. Her voice dropped. I didn't know what it was. Not then. I thought it was simply Matteo being Matteo. He was always dramatic about things that mattered to him. And now? Said Poirot. She met his eyes and said nothing, which was, under the circumstances, rather eloquent. He found Lorenzo Valenti in the garden, not the formal terrace, but the working garden on the villa's eastern side, where vegetables grew in raised beds with the unfussy practicality of things intended for use rather than admiration. Valenti stood among them looking as out of place as a man could look, and as though he had come here precisely because of that, because no one would look for him somewhere he did not belong. Poirot approached and stood beside him without preamble. "When did your son last disobey you?" he asked. Valenti's mouth curved just slightly. It was not quite a smile. "You mean in a matter of consequence. I mean in a matter that made you understand you had lost him. Not to circumstance or distance, to himself." The older man was quiet for a time, looking at a row of tomatoes with the unseeing attention of deep thought. "He was 19, he said at last. I had arranged an internship for him. A financial house in Milan, very distinguished, the sort of beginning from which careers and fortunes are made. He lasted 3 weeks. He left without telling me and spent the summer working on an organic farm in Calabria, sending back photographs of his hands in the soil. A pause, very brief. He was happy in those photographs. Absurdly, authentically happy. I was furious for 6 months. And then? And then I was afraid, Valenti said simply, because I understood that his happiness and my plans for him were not the same territory, and I did not know how to reach him in his. He turned to look at Poirot with the eyes that had, over the previous hours, shed their professional frost and revealed something considerably more difficult beneath. "I loved my son, Monsieur Poirot. I want you to understand that. Whatever you discover, and I imagine you will discover a great deal, I loved him." "Yes," said Poirot, "and in the manner of such love, you wish to keep him." Valenti said nothing. In the raised beds, the tomatoes ripened in the Mediterranean sun with cheerful indifference. Read. When Poirot located him on the upper terrace with a large Scotch that was doing limited service as a prop, was a different order of challenge. Where Adriana had been stripped and Valenti had been exposed, Reed was contracting, visibly pulling his considerable personality inward, reducing his footprint, becoming careful in the way of a man who has assessed the situation and found it financially threatening. Poirot sat, declined a drink, and regarded him with mild, companionable interest. "Tell me," he said conversationally, "who were you before you became impressive?" Reed stared. It was, Poirot noted, the first entirely unguarded expression he had yet produced. "I beg your pardon?" "It's a simple question. You are a self-made man. This is evident, and I mean it without disparagement. Self-made men are interesting. They carry their original selves beneath the constructed one, and occasionally, under sufficient pressure, the original self becomes briefly visible. He tilted his head. "The Cayman account, Monsieur Reed. The 5 million euros transferred in Matteo Valenti's name in the early hours of this morning. I think you did not arrange that transfer. I think you did not know it was coming. And I think the question of what frightens you more, being suspected of murder, or having your financial arrangements examined by Italian authorities, is one you are currently finding very difficult to answer." The Scotch glass descended to the table with slightly more force than intended. "I want a lawyer." "That is your right," said Poirot pleasantly. "Though I am not, of course, the police. I am merely an interested party making conversation." He rose, unsmoothing an invisible crease from his jacket. "It is, however, worth reflecting that whoever arranged that transfer did so with the explicit intention that your name should be attached to it. They considered you an acceptable sacrifice. I find that the people most successfully used as instruments of misdirection are invariably those who have given others sufficient material to work with." He left Reed with that, and with his scotch, and made his way back through the villa's cool interior. In the entrance hall, Juliette Arnaud was crossing towards the staircase. She slowed when she saw him. Her face had the quality of someone who has been conducting a private argument and has not yet determined the winner. "The item from the table setting," Poirot said without preliminary. "I think you are ready now. To tell me what it was." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and placed on the marble surface of the console table between them a small, flat key, the kind used for safe deposit boxes, with a paper tag attached on which was written, in a hand Poirot did not yet recognize, a single address in Naples. "He sent it to me," Juliette said. Her voice was very steady and very tired and entirely without artifice. 3 days before he disappeared, he said if anything happened, I would know what to do with it." She looked at the key as though it contained the sum total of everything she had failed to prevent. "I loved him," she said. "Not in the past tense, Monsieur Poirot. I am not yet able to manage the past tense." Poirot picked up the key with great care. "Then let us," he said gently, "ensure that what he trusted you to do is done." Chapter 6. The Hidden Economy. The road to Naples wound down from the Amalfi Heights with a combination of breathtaking scenery and engineering that seemed, at points, frankly optimistic. Poirot sat in the back of the hired car with his hands folded on his knee and his gaze directed inward rather than at the passing cliffs, which were spectacular but not, at this particular moment, his primary concern. Inspector Ferrara had been persuaded, with a minimum of difficulty and a maximum of Poirot's most considerate diplomacy, to permit a brief excursion to the city. The inspector was an intelligent man. He understood that Poirot's usefulness to the investigation was proportional to Poirot's freedom of movement, and he had extracted in return only the promise of full disclosure before any arrest was contemplated. Poirot had given it sincerely. He intended to keep it. The key in his breast pocket was small and unremarkable and felt, against his chest, of considerable weight. The address on its paper tag led him, after some navigation through the organized chaos of Neapolitan streets, to a private banking establishment of modest frontage and substantial reputation. The sort of institution that does not advertise, whose clients find it by recommendation and whose discretion is, in the most literal sense, its primary product. A young woman at the front desk examined Poirot's credentials, examined the key, consulted briefly with a superior, and then led him to a small room of absolute quiet where a safe deposit box of medium size was placed on the table before him. He opened it. Inside, a portable hard drive, sealed in a padded envelope with Poirot's name written on it in the same hand as the paper tag. Beneath it, a sealed letter addressed in Italian to a journalist at La Repubblica, whose name Poirot recognized as someone of considerable courage and rather considerable enemies. And beneath that, a second envelope, this one unsealed, containing a handwritten note of perhaps 3 pages and a forged passport in the name of Marco Ferretti. The photograph unmistakably Matteo Valenti's, the age given as 30, the occupation listed with a faint, dark humour that struck Poirot somewhere near the heart. As farmer, he read the handwritten note in its entirety, twice. Then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table and his eyes closed, not in thought exactly, but in something that might, in a man of lesser self-containment, have resembled sorrow. Matteo Valenti had written clearly, without self-pity and without drama, which somehow made the reading of it considerably harder than either of those qualities would have. He had documented over the course of 18 months the structure of his father's financial network, the shell corporations in Cyprus and the Caymans, the art transactions that served as mechanisms for the movement of money of uncertain origin, the names of individuals and institutions involved. He had been careful, thorough, and, it was plain, frightened. Not of the exposure itself, but of what the exposure would cost the people around him. There were 2 pages of careful arrangements made for Juliet. There was a single paragraph about Adriana that Poirot did not read a second time, because once was sufficient, and the little grey cells had their own form of decency. He had not, the note made clear, intended to disappear permanently. He had intended to place the evidence, ensure its delivery, and then go. Somewhere small, somewhere honest, somewhere that had not been purchased. He had calculated the risks with the clear-eyed realism of a young man who has thought about something difficult for a very long time. He had not, it was also plain, calculated all of them correctly. Poirot returned to the villa in the early evening, the hard drive in his jacket pocket and a great deal in his mind. He went first to his own rooms, where he sat in the excellent chair by the window and spent 40 minutes doing nothing visible whatsoever, which was, for anyone who understood his methods, a period of very intensive activity indeed. The shape of it was becoming clear. Not the whole, not yet, but enough of it that he could see where the remaining pieces must lie and roughly what form they would take when he found them. He knew now why the money had moved after Matteo's death. He knew with reasonable certainty why the beach tableau had been arranged with such care. He knew the function of the forged transfer in Reed's name. What he did not yet know, with the precision that he required before he could act with justice, rather than merely with probability, was the method by which the poison had been administered. And the when and the where and the what were questions for Ferrara's toxicologists. The how required understanding not of chemistry, but of access. He went to find the Countess. Sofia Markovich was in the garden at the cliff's edge, standing where the stone balustrade gave way to open air, and the sea lay 300 feet below, in the last of the light. She heard him approach, and did not turn immediately, which suggested she had heard him some time before she acknowledged him. A small piece of intelligence in itself. "I owe you a more complete answer than I gave you this morning," she said, when he had taken a position beside her. The wind off the sea moved through her hair with an impartiality that no hairdresser could have achieved. "You asked when I realized I had been replaced. I gave you something evasive." "You gave me composure in the place of an answer," Poirot agreed, "a thing you have had long practice at providing." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the water had deepened to indigo, and a single fishing boat was moving along the coast, with its light burning small and steady against the dark. "3 years ago," she said, "Lorenzo told me there was a business matter requiring his full attention for some months, and that it would be better, for my sake as much as his, if I returned to Belgrade for the summer. I went. The business matter did not resolve. The summer extended." Her voice was level, unhurried, the tone of someone who has processed a wound so thoroughly it has become simply a fact. By autumn, I understood. He had decided I was no longer useful, not unkind. Lorenzo is never unkind as a matter of style, but entirely clear. I was a chapter that had concluded. "And yet you are here," Poirot said. "And yet I am here." She smiled faintly. "Because I have nowhere else sufficiently comfortable to be, and because Lorenzo's guilt is a better security than my remaining assets, and because—" She stopped. "Because Matteo invited me, specifically privately, 3 weeks ago. He wrote to me. He said there were things at the villa that required a witness he could trust, and he trusted me, because I had no reason to protect his father." Poirot turned to look at her with a tension of a quality that would have informed a more self-aware person that something significant had just occurred. "Matteo invited you himself." "Yes. The timing surprised me. He knew I remained on civil terms with Lorenzo, and I suspect that was part of it. An arrangement of my presence here without it appearing arranged." She met his gaze. "I think he expected to be here himself. I think whatever he feared would happen happened earlier than he calculated." "What did you observe," Poirot said carefully, "on the night before the body was found? Specifically, after dinner, when the others had retired?" The Countess considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I could not sleep. I came down to the lower terrace, the one above the beach steps, at perhaps 11:30. I sat there for perhaps half an hour." She paused. "I saw a light on the beach below. Very brief, a torch perhaps, or a telephone, and I heard a voice, only one voice, carrying on the water." "A man or a woman?" "A man, speaking Italian, too low and too distant for words, and then the light went out, and there was nothing further." "And this," Poirot said with great gentleness, "you did not tell Inspector Ferrara." "Inspector Ferrara did not ask the right question." She turned back to the sea. "You did." Poirot excused himself shortly after and climbed the interior stairs to the floor above, where a long corridor connected the principal guest rooms. He walked its length slowly, pausing at intervals until he reached the door of the room assigned to Adriana Valenti. He did not knock. He stood in the corridor and thought about the live stream, about an alibi constructed of 40,000 witnesses, none of whom were physically present, all of whom had watched a screen rather than a room. A screen that had not, in the footage Ferrara had obtained, shown the gold chain at Adriana's throat. He thought about the hollow weight of it. He thought about what could be secreted within a pendant small enough to be worn daily and overlooked entirely. by everyone except a Belgian detective of advancing years, whose tendency to notice the wrong things had, over the course of a long career, proved remarkably useful. A marine toxin, Ferrara had said, specialized, requiring knowledge or very particular connections, or a very particular method of delivery. He returned to his rooms and wrote 3 careful paragraphs in his small, precise notebook, underlined one phrase twice, and drew a line connecting 2 observations he had made on the first evening that had, until this moment, seemed merely peripheral. The line, once drawn, it was entirely obvious. It always was. Chapter 7. The Mask of Gold. He slept, and in the morning he was certain. Certainty, in Poirot's experience, arrived not with fanfare but with the quiet finality of a key turning in a lock. A small sound, almost disappointing in its simplicity, and then the door standing open to reveal everything that had been obscured. He lay still for several minutes after waking, examining the whole construction of it with the methodical satisfaction of a man checking a completed proof, testing each joint, confirming each connection, finding nothing that gave way under pressure. Then he rose, dressed with his customary precision, and went to find Dr. Takahashi. The art investor was, as had become something of a habit, seated apart from the general activity of the villa, this morning in a small courtyard off the eastern corridor, where a stone bench and an orange tree occupied a space of pleasing geometric simplicity. He was reading. He closed the book when Poirot appeared and regarded him with the composed attention of a man who has been expecting a conversation and has prepared himself for it. Monsieur Poirot. He gestured towards the bench with quiet courtesy. Please. Poirot sat. The morning was still cool, and the orange tree held its fruit with the unstudied elegance of something that has not been told it is decorative. You have been, if you will forgive the observation, very quiet throughout these proceedings, Docteur, Poirot said. A man of your particular connections and knowledge, connections which extend, I understand, into some rather specialized areas of the art shipping trade, might have been expected to take a more active part in the general agitation. Takahashi regarded him without visible discomfort. I find agitation rarely productive. Quite so, nor, I suspect, do you find it necessary when one has nothing to conceal. Poirot folded his hands on his knee. Or rather, when what one has to conceal is already concealed by other means. He paused, allowing the distinction to settle. The toxin used to kill Matteo Valenti. Ferrara's people have been characterizing it as specialized, marine in origin, requiring either expertise or unusual connections to obtain. Art shipping, as you may be aware, presents certain opportunities for the movement of small quantities of controlled or exotic substances within sealed consignments. It is a method occasionally documented in the literature of customs enforcement. The silence between them was entirely comfortable, which was itself interesting. I did not provide the substance, Takahashi said, after a measured interval. His voice was level, factual, the tone of a man correcting a minor error rather than defending himself against a serious charge. I was approached, some months ago before this gathering was arranged, by an intermediary. The approach concerned certain items in transit. I declined. And you reported neither the approach nor your declination to anyone. To whom would I have reported it? The approach was implicit rather than explicit, a matter of what was made available rather than what was requested. He looked at the orange tree with the expression of a man selecting words with care. I am not an innocent, Monsieur Poirot. I operate in commercial spaces where the line between the legitimate and the irregular is not always clearly marked. But I am also not a fool. When I understood the nature of what was being suggested, I stepped away from it and came here regardless. I came here because Lorenzo Valenti is a significant collector and a potential client, and because declining an implicit approach does not require one to make enemies by refusing a subsequent perfectly legitimate invitation. He turned his gaze back to Poirot. The person who approached me is someone within this villa. I suspected it before I arrived. I have been more certain of it since. Poirot studied him. You will tell Inspector Ferrara what you have told me. I had already decided to do so today. A faint pause. I'm relieved to have told you first. You are, if I may say, somewhat easier to talk to. Poirot thanked him with sincerity and took his leave. He had one more thing to confirm before the picture was complete, and it required a return to the scene of its origination. He descended the cliff steps to the beach, the body long since removed, the sand raked smooth by someone's anxious staff, and stood at the foot of the steps, looking at the space where Matteo Valenti had been found. The striped towel, the champagne bucket, and 2 flutes. He had thought about those flutes a great deal. If Matteo had been poisoned by something in his food or drink, and if the toxin had been administered that evening rather than earlier, then someone had been with him. The Countess had heard one voice, a man's voice, carrying on the water. One voice, and which meant either that Matteo had not spoken or that there had been no occasion for him to reply. The careful arrangement of the scene afterward, the smoothed sand, the positioned objects, argued for a deliberation that coexisted uncomfortably with the idea of a spontaneous late-night encounter. Not spontaneous, arranged. Matteo had come to the beach expecting someone, or had been brought there by an invitation he trusted. He looked at the chalk-pale cliff above him, at the dark line of the steps carved into it, at the upper terrace visible at the cliff's edge. And he thought about what the Countess had observed from precisely that vantage point. One light, one voice, a man. And then he thought about the pendant. Here he climbed back up the steps with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees have formed certain views on the subject of cliff staircases, and went directly to Juliet Arnaud's office. She was there, working with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has found that occupation keeps the worst of the interior weather at bay. She looked up when he entered and waited without speaking. The necklace, Poirot said. Matteo gave it to Adriana. He told her it was important that she should keep it safe. You were present at this villa in the weeks before the guests arrived. Did you see the necklace before Adriana brought it? Juliet's expression underwent a careful realignment. Yes, Matteo had it here, in the villa, some weeks before the gathering. He wore it himself for a time. He told me... She stopped, reconsidered. He told me it was a security arrangement. Something he was carrying for reasons he did not wish to specify, but which were, he said, protective. And then he gave it to his sister. He placed it in her luggage himself before she arrived with a note. I saw him do it. She paused. I thought it was sentimental, a memento of some kind. He communicated a great deal through objects rather than words. He trusted objects to carry meaning more reliably than conversation. Poirot was very still. "He placed it in her luggage before she arrived," he said quietly, "which means the necklace was in his possession, and then deliberately transferred, which means—" He did not complete the sentence aloud. It was not necessary. He thanked Juliet and crossed the villa's interior to the staircase, climbing to Matteo's rooms with the focused calm of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for, and has known for several hours precisely where it will be. The velvet watch box on the shelf in the wardrobe. He opened it. The photograph. The gap in the satin where the weight of a second object had compressed the lining into a faint but unmistakable depression. He had measured that depression with his eye on his first examination. He had thought, not a watch, not a key. Something flat, something rigid, something of moderate weight. A tracking device registered to Matteo's private security arrangements. He had confirmed this with Ferrara that morning before breakfast, a quiet telephone call whose contents he had not yet fully shared. The device, built into the pendant's hollow base, they had recorded location data continuously for 3 months. 3 months of Matteo's movements. The last recorded position before the signal ceased was the Villa Serena's private beach at 11:47 in the evening, 3 nights ago. But the device was no longer in the box. It was around Adriana's throat where Matteo had placed it. In her luggage before she arrived, believing presumably that she would be safer carrying it than leaving it where it might be found and destroyed. He had been protecting the evidence of his own movements, and someone else had known the necklace existed, had known what it contained, had known that if the device were ever recovered and its data examined, there would be a record of every meeting, every location, every private arrangement Matteo Valenti had made in his last months of life, including, necessarily, his meetings with the person who killed him. The pendant had to be taken, but not from Matteo. He was already beyond the reach of such precautions. From Adriana. Poirot replaced the watchbox with great care and stood in Matteo's room for a long moment, looking at the photographs pinned above the desk. The trattoria, the protest, the inexpensive coast, and at the portrait of the boy on the beach in the living room beyond, the father's arm around him, the unguarded laughing face. He had built everything, Lorenzo Valenti had whispered. Everything. Everything except the one thing that could not be built, could not be purchased, could not be secured by any instrument of wealth or authority. The freedom to be himself. Os Poirot straightened his tie with the precision of a man who has reached the end of his deliberations and is now simply a matter of moments away from their conclusion. The question that remained was not what had happened or how or in what order. He knew those things now with a completeness that satisfied even his exacting standards. The question, the only question left, was how to prove it in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives performing innocence. He found as he descended the stairs towards that inevitable gathering that he was looking forward to demonstrating the answer. Chapter 8. The Inversion. The terrace had been arranged by Poirot's quiet request, and Ferrara's cooperative authority precisely as it had appeared on the first evening. Same chairs, same positions, a same theatrical backdrop of sea and failing light. The champagne had been brought up, a different vintage, which Poirot noted and which the others presumably did not. And the crystal glasses caught the sunset with the same indifferent beauty as before. The empty chair had not been replaced. It stood where it had stood at dinner, set now without silver or flowers, simply present, simply empty. Poirot had requested this also. The chair had work to do. They assembled with the varied reluctance of people who understand they are being managed and cannot determine precisely how. Reed arrived first, which surprised no one. A man of his temperament finds waiting alone more intolerable than almost any other condition. He took his original seat and occupied it with the careful stillness of someone who has been coached by a lawyer, which he had. The Countess came next, in black, with the upright carriage of someone using posture as a last line of defence. Then Adriana, who moved to her chair without looking at anyone and sat with her hands folded in her lap and the gold chain at her throat, catching the last of the light. Takahashi settled quietly at the table's edge with the withdrawn attentiveness he had maintained throughout, now carrying an additional quality. The particular alertness of a man who knows what is coming and has aligned himself, privately, with its arrival. Juliette Arnaud took her seat last, directly across from the empty chair, and looked at it with an expression that required no interpretation. Lorenzo Valenti did not sit. He stood at the balustrade where he had stood on that first evening, his back half turned to the gathering, yet his face to the sea. He had aged, Poirot thought, in some interior way that did not necessarily show in his face, but registered in the quality of his stillness. The stillness now, not of controlled authority, but of a man bracing himself against something he can neither prevent nor redirect. Poirot remained standing. He did not pace. Pacing was theatrical, in a manner he found rather beneath him, but positioned himself where he could see all of them at once, with the last of the sun behind him. "I am grateful to you all," he began, "for your patience with an old man's arrangement of furniture." He spoke in English as he had throughout, with the faint continental precision that was as much a part of his equipment as his notebook. "I shall not detain you longer than is necessary. It has been my experience that the truth, once one has arrived at it, requires considerably less time to state than it required to discover." He paused and let the silence work on them for a moment. "We have been told that Matteo Valenti was travelling. We know now that this was not so. He was here, within reach of this villa, making the final arrangements of a plan he had been constructing for the better part of a year. A plan to leave, yes, but first, to illuminate, to place in the hands of a responsible journalist evidence of financial arrangements that he regarded, with the moral seriousness that characterized him, as indefensible. He glanced at Valenti's back. He was not in this a vindictive man. He was simply an honest one. In certain families the distinction is academic. In this family it was catastrophic. Reed shifted in his chair. Poirot noted it and continued without acknowledging it. The 5 million euros transferred from Matteo's trust account in the early hours following his death, a transfer bearing his signature and completed after he was incapable of completing it, was not a theft. It was a fabrication, designed to point suspicion at Monsieur Reed, whose financial irregularities made him a convenient instrument of misdirection. The person who arranged that transfer had access to Matteo's banking credentials. They had access to his signature. They had access to a great deal that only proximity and long intimacy provides. Juliette had gone very still. "The necklace," Poirot said, turning slightly towards Adriana. "Your brother placed it in your luggage himself before you arrived. And he understood that the tracking device within the pendant constituted a record, a precise, time-stamped record of his movements over 3 months. Every meeting, every location, every arrangement. He could not carry it himself any longer. The risk of its discovery and destruction was too great. He trusted it to you because you were, of all the people in his world, the one least likely to be searched and the one most likely, if matters went wrong, to understand its significance. Adriana's hand went to the chain. She had, Poirot noticed, stopped pretending she did not know what it contained somewhere between Chapter 5 and the present moment. The device, Poirot continued, records a final position, the private beach, at 11:47 in the evening. Matteo went there to meet someone he trusted, and someone who had invited him, not forcibly, not under any detectable compulsion, to a private conversation on neutral ground. The champagne was already there. The glasses were set. The meeting had been arranged in advance by the person who was already on the beach when Matteo arrived. He paused. The Countess Markovich heard one voice on the water that night, a man's voice, not 2 voices, 1. Matteo, I submit, had already consumed what he had been given before he spoke a word. He looked directly at Lorenzo Valenti's back. "The amuse-bouche," he said, and his voice was very quiet now, very level in the way of things that do not require force because they carry sufficient weight of their own. "A private preparation, as the beach arrangement was private, requiring knowledge of Matteo's particular habits, your knowledge of the villa's kitchen protocols, and access to a substance of considerable specialization. The approach made to Dr. Takahashi through art shipping channels, which he declined, found another route entirely. A route that required neither customs nor carriers. Only a man who owns the villa, employs the kitchen staff, and has spent 30 years acquiring whatever he determines to acquire." Valenti had not moved. The pendant, Poirot said, had to be recovered. Not from Matteo, he was beyond recovery, but from whoever carried it afterward. You knew the device existed because you arranged his security yourself, Signor Valenti. You knew it was recording. You knew that if it were recovered and its data examined, your presence on that beach would be established beyond any argument. Every movement of yours on that evening, every movement of his, preserved in miniature on a circuit smaller than a shirt button. A long silence. Reed looked at the tablecloth. The Countess looked at her hands. Takahashi looked at nothing in particular with the focused discipline of a man who has decided that his only function at this moment is to witness. Juliette Arnaud looked at Lorenzo Valenti with an expression of such concentrated grief and rage that it constituted in itself a verdict. Adriana removed the chain from her throat. She did not place it on the table. She held it in her closed fist, and her closed fist rested on the table's surface, and she said nothing whatsoever, which was, Poirot thought, probably the most controlled thing he had seen in a villa that had produced a considerable quantity of control. Your Valenti turned from the balustrade. He looked diminished, not smaller in any physical sense. He was still a tall man, still silver-haired and straight-backed, still wearing the clothes of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. But something internal had been removed, as though the armature had been withdrawn from a sculpture that had always depended on it, and what remained was simply the outer form, unsupported. "You cannot prove," he said, "what you cannot prove." "I think," Poirot replied gently, "that you will find the device proves it admirably. Inspector Ferrara has had it since this morning." He watched Valenti's face as the sentence arrived and was understood. The tracking chain had been removed from Adriana's throat, not by her, not by Juliet, not by any of the guests, but by Ferrara's officer, ushered at Poirot's quiet instruction, while Adriana slept and the villa was still, and the Mediterranean went about its ancient business below the cliff. A replacement, indistinguishable in weight and appearance, rested against Adriana's collarbone throughout the day. She had not been told. Poirot had not liked this concealment, but he had judged it necessary, and Ferrara had agreed. The data was already with the technical division in Naples. It would, Poirot was entirely confident, show precisely what he had said it would show. Valenti looked at his daughter. She looked back at him across the table and the empty chair, and the flat, cooling glasses of untouched champagne. And what passed between them in that look was something that had no name in any of the languages she spoke fluently, and did not require one. "My son," Valenti said, or to no one in particular. "Yes," said Poirot, "your son." Below the terrace, the sea continued its indifferent and magnificent work. The sun achieved the horizon with its customary excess of colour, and then was gone, and the light that remained was the cool, flat, unglamorous light of aftermath, which does not flatter and was never designed to. It illuminated everything perfectly. Chapter 9. The Value of Truth. The terrace emptied slowly in the way of places where something definitive has occurred, and no one is quite certain of the protocol for departing. Reed left first with the purposeful stride of a man whose lawyer was waiting on a telephone and whose primary concern had shifted, with some relief, from murder to the considerably more familiar territory of financial irregularity. The Countess rose with the deliberate composure of someone who has survived a great many rooms, and will survive this one, touched Adriana's shoulder briefly as she passed, a gesture of such uncharacteristic simplicity that it seemed to surprise them both, and went inside without looking at Valenti. Takahashi excused himself with a small bow directed at no one in particular, and the expression of a man mentally composing a statement for Inspector Ferrara that would be thorough, accurate, and carefully bounded. That left around the table with its untouched champagne and the failing light, Adriana and Juliet and Lorenzo Valenti, and Poirot, who remained standing because the situation seemed to him to require it. Ferrara and his officer appeared at the terrace entrance. This had been arranged, timed to the minute, and its arrival now was neither dramatic nor apologetic, simply procedural, the mechanism of justice operating at its own unhurried pace. Ferrara met Poirot's eyes briefly across the terrace and gave a small nod. Valenti saw the nod. He understood it with the quick intelligence that had served him throughout a long career of reading rooms and interpreting signals, and something in him that had been held at considerable tension since the beginning of the gathering appeared, quietly and without spectacle, to release. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood where he was at the balustrade's edge, looking at his daughter, and waited. "Before the inspector proceeds," Poirot said, addressing the table rather than any individual at it, "I should like to complete what I began. Not for the purposes of the law, Ferrara has what he requires, but because this family, and those connected to it, have been living for some time inside a version of events constructed by someone else, and they deserve to inhabit the true one, whatever its dimensions." He moved to the empty chair and rested one hand briefly on its back. The toxin was acquired through a shipping consignment arranged by Valenti's own logistics network, a network that moves art between private collectors across 3 continents, and which Inspector Ferrara's colleagues in Naples and Rome have been examining with increasing interest for the better part of a year. The specific substance is native to certain marine organisms found off the southern Japanese coast. It requires cold storage and careful handling. It was brought to the villa inside a sealed container within a larger shipment, logged as conservation materials for a Fontana canvas. The one, you may recall, that hangs in the study. He paused. The study that faces the sea. Where the Morandi hangs opposite and the portrait of a boy on a beach hangs between them. Nobody looked at Valenti. This collective not looking was, in its way, as eloquent as anything that had been said. The method of administration was the point at which this crime required its greatest ingenuity. Poirot continued. A poison introduced into the general food supply is detectable and indiscriminate. A poison introduced into a single person's consumption on a given evening requires either access to that person's plate after it has been prepared, which invites witnesses, or a vehicle of delivery so intimate and so private that no kitchen, no staff member, no fellow guest is implicated at all. He looked at the table's surface. Matteo was invited to the beach for a private conversation. He was offered champagne, already poured, already waiting. 1 glass was his. 1 glass was not consumed by the person who invited him, because that person knew what the glass contained. Juliet made a sound, not a word, barely a breath, and pressed her hand flat against the table as though steadying herself against something that was trying to move beneath her. The preparation was done in advance, Poirot said, in private, by a man who, in the course of building a considerable empire, had acquired the habit of solving problems himself when the solution required absolute discretion. He did not delegate this. He could not delegate this. What he wished to prevent was not merely exposure. The lawyers and the accountants and the offshore structures might have managed exposure in time with sufficient resource. What he could not manage, what no instrument of wealth can address, was his son's departure, his son's deliberate, considered permanent withdrawal of himself from the life that had been constructed for him. The sun had gone entirely now. The first stars were arriving with the punctual indifference of things operating on a schedule that takes no account of human drama. I built everything for him, Valenti said. His voice was stripped of its professional texture, lower and rougher than Poirot had yet heard it. He was not addressing the table or the terrace or Poirot. He was addressing, or attempting to address, the empty chair. I built everything, the villa, the network, the name, all of it, every decision, every risk, every accommodation made with men I did not respect and transactions I would not have chosen. It was for him, so that he would have what I did not have, so that nothing could diminish him. Yes, said Poirot. And Matteo understood this. He was not, as I have said, a stupid young man. He understood it, and he was, in his own way, grateful for it. But he had arrived by the labour of his own conscience at the understanding that what you had built for him was not a gift. It was an argument that your vision of his life was the correct one, and that his obligation was to inhabit it. The silence was complete. He was not refusing the gift, Poirot said. He was refusing the argument. And that distinction, Signor Valenti, that distinction you could not bear. Adriana rose from her chair. She did not go to her father. She went to Juliet, who was still pressing her hand flat against the table, and stood beside her. Not touching, not speaking, simply present, in the manner of someone who has decided that proximity is the only honest thing available. Valenti watched this. His face had the quality now of landscape after weather. Simplified, exposed, the details that had been accumulated over decades of self-construction stripped back to reveal something considerably older and more elementary beneath. He would have been free, Poirot said very quietly, if you had permitted it. He would have gone and built something small and honest and been happy in it, and perhaps, in time and in the way of children who are genuinely loved rather than possessed, he would have found his way back to you, not to the empire, to the man. He did not say. Instead, you have ensured that he will never come back, that the empire will not survive its own exposure, and that the remainder of your life will be conducted in circumstances of considerable restriction. There was no purpose in saying it. The facts would perform that function with their customary efficiency. Ferrara stepped forward. He was decent about it, which Poirot noted and appreciated. He spoke in Italian, formally but without theatre, and Valenti listened to the formal words with the attentiveness of a man committing something to memory. And then he turned for the last time and looked at the sea. It looked back at him with the complete indifference of something that has been present for the entirety of human history, and has formed no particular opinion as a result. Adriana, when the police boat had cleared the lower terrace, placed the gold chain on the table. The pendant lay where she set it. Small, hollow, the tracking device now removed and in Ferrara's evidence bag, and it caught the starlight with the same reflexive brilliance it had always displayed. Beautiful still. Useful no longer. She left it there. Juliet looked at it for a long moment. He thought of everything, she said. He always thought of everything. He could not stop thinking of everyone else. She stopped. That was what killed him in the end, as much as anything. He had too much consideration for others and not quite enough ruthlessness about himself. It is not the worst epitaph, Poirot said. No, said Juliet. It is not. She picked up the chain, held it for a moment, and then set it down again in a slightly different place, as though she had considered keeping it, and decided, on reflection, that it belonged to a version of things that was now complete. The stars multiplied overhead with quiet industry. Somewhere below the cliff, the sea turned in its sleep. Poirot retrieved his notebook from his breast pocket, uncapped his pen, and drew a single, neat line beneath the last entry. He replaced the cap. He replaced the notebook. The case was closed. The truth was in its correct position. These two facts produced, as they always did, just a satisfaction of the most specific and irreplaceable kind. And beneath it, as they sometimes did, something quieter and less comfortable which he allowed himself to feel without attempting to reclassify it as something more professionally appropriate. Matteo Valenti had thought of everything except the one thing he needed most to think of. He had not thought it possible that love, in sufficient quantity and of the wrong kind, could become the very thing he was running from. Poirot put on his jacket, straightened his cuffs to an exactness that the darkness made unnecessary, and went inside. Chapter 10. After the Gold Rush. Morning came to the Villa Serena in the same way it always had, with an absolute indifference to what the previous evening had contained. The jasmine was fragrant, And the sea was a particular shade of blue that painters attempt and generally fail to achieve. The kitchen staff, operating on some deep professional instinct that the requirements of guests supersede the inconvenience of recent arrests, had produced fresh cornetti and excellent coffee and arranged them on the lower terrace with the same flawless attention to placement that had characterized every preceding morning. A gardener was already among the lemon trees. A gull made its slow, critical circuit of the cliff. Poirot stood at his window for a moment before descending, looking at all of this with the complicated appreciation of a man who loves beauty and distrusts it in equal measure, and who has spent a long career demonstrating that the two responses are not contradictory, but, in fact, inseparable. He descended and found 3 of them at breakfast. Adriana sat with her coffee and nothing else, the untouched cornetto on her plate, the only visible evidence that the gesture of ordinary morning life had been attempted and abandoned. She looked smaller than she had at any point during the preceding days. Not diminished exactly, but reduced to something more accurate. Without the social apparatus operating at full capacity, she was simply a young woman of 26 who had lost her brother and learned in the same week the full dimensions of what her father had been and done. It was, Poirot thought, a considerable amount to carry into a Wednesday morning. Juliet sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders were very nearly touching. She was not eating either. She had a folder of papers before her that she was not reading. And the papers were, Poirot suspected, the practical consequences of the previous evening beginning to arrange themselves into columns. There would be questions about the estate, about Valenti's various structures and holdings, about what the investigation would require and in what sequence. Juliet's instinct, even now, was to manage what could be managed. Poirot found this neither cold nor admirable, but simply human. The particular humanity of someone whose competence has always been the only shelter available. The Countess was absent, which Poirot had expected. She would be packing with the methodical efficiency of a woman who has learned not to leave things behind when circumstances change quickly. He bore her no ill will for her departure. She had told the truth when he required it, which was more than could be said for several of the others, and rather more than her history of self-preservation would have suggested. Reed was also absent, and would be, Poirot judged, in a car heading towards Naples, and a flight to somewhere with a cooperative tax environment before the morning was much further advanced. Inspector Ferrara had, Poirot knew, flagged this probability and made the appropriate notifications to the appropriate authorities. What became of Reed's financial arrangements was not, strictly speaking, Poirot's concern. He had been a tool in someone else's construction and had escaped the worst of it, though the examination of his affairs that was now inevitable would produce, Poirot suspected, a period of sustained discomfort. There was a rough justice in this that he did not find entirely unsatisfying. He poured his coffee and sat. "Monsieur Poirot," Adriana said, without preliminary. Her voice was steady in the way of things that have been made steady by effort rather than circumstance. "Will you tell me honestly, did he know? At the end, on the beach? Did he understand what was happening?" Poirot considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. "The substance," he said carefully, "acts with some rapidity once absorbed. The medical evidence suggests that consciousness would have been impaired very quickly, and that any distress would have been brief." He paused. Whether he understood, in the moments before that, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that he went to that beach voluntarily in response to an invitation from his father, and that the meeting was therefore not one he feared. He did not go in dread. He went, I think, with some form of hope. Adriana absorbed this. Something in her face shifted, minutely, towards something that was not comfort, but was adjacent to it. He always went with hope, she said. It was characteristic. Juliet said nothing, but the folder of papers was set aside with a finality that suggested it would not be reopened soon. Poirot drank his coffee, which was very good, and looked at the sea and allowed himself a few minutes of simple breakfast in the morning sunshine. A thing he had, he reflected, earned. He spoke with Inspector Ferrara by telephone at 10 o'clock. The tracking device data had confirmed what the little grey cells had already determined. Valenti's presence on the beach, Matteo's arrival, the signal's cessation. The timeline was clean and damning. The network investigation, which had been proceeding on its own track for some months, would now accelerate considerably, assisted by the contents of the hard drive from the Naples safe deposit box, which Matteo Valenti had assembled with the painstaking thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth, to be useful, must be irrefutable. It would, Ferrara said quietly, be a significant case. He thanked Poirot with the unaffected warmth of a man whose gratitude is genuine and who sees no reason to conceal it. Poirot thanked him in return for the quality of his coffee and the absence of unnecessary obstruction, which were, he said, the things he valued most in a collaborative arrangement. Ferrara laughed. It was a good sound in the morning air. Takahashi had already left. But with a brief and courteous note delivered to Poirot's room, containing a statement in precise, formal English that would be useful to the investigators, and a separate, personal paragraph expressing, without sentimentality, something that amounted to respect. Poirot read it twice and put it in his breast pocket, where it joined a small but select collection of communications he had found worth keeping. He spent the remaining hours of the morning in his room, completing certain notes and writing a long letter to a former colleague in Brussels who had, on 2 separate occasions, assisted him in matters touching on international financial legislation, and who would find the structural details of Valenti's network of considerable professional interest. He wrote in French, which he always preferred for correspondence requiring precision, and sealed the envelope with the neat satisfaction of a man completing a task he had been trained to complete and has not lost the pleasure of. At 2:30 in the afternoon, his bags were brought down by a young man who took particular care of the largest case, which contained Poirot's suit in cream linen, now cleaned and pressed by the villa's laundry to a standard that, under the circumstances, seemed almost poignant. He found Adriana waiting in the entrance hall. She had dressed with care. The black of the previous evening had been replaced by something simpler and less declarative. A linen the colour of dry sand, unadorned. The gold chain was absent from her throat for the first time since Poirot's arrival, and its absence was conspicuous in the way of things long present suddenly removed, like a word taken out of a sentence that changes the meaning of what remains. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said. "That is kind," said Poirot. She looked at him with the directness that had occasionally broken through the performance, and that he had always found, when it appeared, considerably more interesting than anything the performance produced. "What will happen now to me, to the Valenti name, to all of it? I don't know how to think about it clearly yet. Everything I have been is connected to everything he built." "Yes," said Poirot, "but consider, you also funded your brother's attempt to disentangle that connection. You carried what he trusted you to carry. You did not perform innocence to me when performance would have been the simpler choice." He tilted his head. "Who you are and what you have inherited are not the same territory, mademoiselle. Your brother understood this about himself at some considerable cost. You have the advantage of understanding it at somewhat less." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the ghost of something that was not quite yet a smile but was moving in that direction, "He would have liked you, I think." "I believe," said Poirot, with complete sincerity, "that I would have liked him very much." The hired car wound down from the villa toward the Amalfi Road and then north, with the sea on one side and the rock face on the other, and the extraordinary light of the Italian afternoon making beauty of everything it touched without discrimination or judgment. Poirot sat in the back with his hat on his knee and watched it go past. He thought about what had been expensive and what had been precious in the particular vocabulary of this case, and about how rarely the two categories had overlapped. He thought about a boy on a public beach, leaning against his father without reservation, photographed by no one. He thought about a cheap, faded image kept inside a velvet box, and the inscription on its back, and the particular weight of love that has curdled into something it was never meant to become. At the station in Naples, he ordered an espresso at the counter, standing as the Italians do. It was served in a small, thick cup without embellishment of any kind. He drank it in 3 sips. It was perfect. It required nothing added to it and nothing taken away, and it was entirely, completely sufficient. He straightened his tie, which did not require straightening, tucked his hat precisely under his arm, and walked toward the platform where the northbound train was waiting with the patient, purposeful readiness of something that knows where it is going. Behind him, the station went about its business. In front of him, the train pointed toward home. And somewhere above the cliff on the Amalfi Coast, the Villa Serena received its fresh flowers, restocked its champagne, and prepared its best face for the next beautiful guests, who would arrive knowing nothing and perform everything. On a stage that the sun illuminated with the same magnificent, unjudging, entirely indifferent generosity it had always provided. The curtain, as it always does, rose again. Hercule Poirot did not look back. The end